Hi, I'm Sharon Bill. Back again. Today I'd like to talk to you about scales, just generally, scales in general. Why on earth should we bother? And hopefully when I've convinced you as to why we should bother, then I want to think about how best to go about it. Literally, scale just means step. Literally stepping next door notes up whatever instrument it is that you're playing. On the music, it should look like the steps lining up, just stepping up the ladder of line space, line space, line space. There may be some sharps and flats changing that depending on which scale pattern you're using. However, it should always be a step, so every note should be accounted for. So say we were starting on a C scale, there should be a C something, a D something, an E something, an F something, right the way up, stepping up every note in turn. And so, for example, if we're starting on a G, let's say for example G major, there should be a G something, an A something, a B something, a C something, a D something, and an E something, an F something, and a G something. So we call that F sharp because we're replacing the F, not G. You wouldn't say E, G flat G. We've got G twice and only F once. So we just need to take each note in turn, and that will depend upon what scale pattern we're doing. However, there are lots of scales. Here's a few examples. So these are the Hanon scale studies, just sort of fingering exercises. Here's my ancient, aged, beloved copy of the ABRSM. There is a new one of these out now, but I just love this one. You can see there are an awful lot, and there are more and more. This is just a select few. When I was studying for my grade 8 years ago, back in the older ABRSM system, gosh, that makes me sound ancient. I think for my grade 8, when you divided out all the permutations of right hand, left hand, hands together, and all the sort of more advanced permutations, there were well over 200 scales that I had to work through. There are lots and lots of different scales. However, why should we bother? There are so many practical benefits. Regardless of which instrument you play, the principles remain the same. First of all, one of the main benefits of playing scales is to develop a good fingering discipline. It teaches your fingers to do as they're told rather than just reflex action, moving to what you feel like. There's always a natural sort of inclination to avoid fingers 4 and 5 on the piano, and I would imagine with any other instrument, because these are weak fingers. That takes us to the second benefit of why we should do scales, because it builds finger strength. As you're practicing the different scale patterns, it makes much more use of these that we would ordinarily tend to avoid. It's like gym work for your fingers, and like any exercise, it's a physical development that you're working on, and so we need to practice regularly, starting off small and building up slowly, so that we work those muscles and get those finger muscles developed. Beyond the practicalities of the physical aspects of playing scales, if you practice your scales regularly, it develops an understanding of key and the systems of harmonies which the music you're playing is built around. It helps you to understand the tonality of the music you play. If you've played the scale of G major loads of times and you know those fingering patterns and you know which sharps are included, when you come to play a piece in the key of G major, you'll already have an understanding of that key and that tonal structure. So again, that takes us to another benefit of, if you practice your scales lots and lots of times, the fingering patterns become established under your fingers. And so when you move on to a piece of music that's got some of those fingering patterns in, those patterns are already transplanted onto your fingers. And so you don't need to practice quite so much because the pattern's already there as you play, and so you get a quicker progress. I admit that to begin with, practicing and learning these scales does take quite a bit of effort. However, once you've got those patterns under your fingers and you can just rattle through them without really having to think too much about it, it's a really relaxing and calming process. There's nothing better than just bashing through a load of scales if you're in a bit of a bad mood. Not that I'm ever in a bad mood, of course, never. But it's really good therapy actually, and sometimes you just feel like doing a bit of piano practice, but you don't really want to just kind of get stuck into the nitty-gritty of note bashing, and it's a good thing to just rattle through some scales sometimes. Now, once you've got these scales under your fingers, there are some good ideas to use that time to think about other things. I've popped a little diagram up there. As you can see, I'm no artist. Actually, it's my husband who's the artist. Maybe I should have asked him to draw this picture for me. So here, there's a little picture showing you a little person sitting there doing their piano practice. And when you're doing your scales, it's a good opportunity to sort of kind of remove your mind from the job in hand and think about the posture of what you are sitting like at the instrument. That works for any instrument, whatever instrument you're playing. However, particularly for the piano, aspects of posture to think about are: make sure that your wrists are sort of straight and level. We don't want kind of this, and we don't want this. We want nice, level wrists, because we need that flexibility to be able to move. When you're playing your scales, there's a lot of tucking under motions. Think of it more of a sideways pivot rather than up and over. We shouldn't have loads of elbow movement. Most of movement should be in the flexibility of the wrist, keeping your wrists level. There's a little bit of angular movement here, but we certainly don't want this because it's too tense, there's no flexibility. Your feet should be flat on the floor, presuming that your legs are long enough to actually reach the floor, with your toes sort of pointing forwards as if you were standing with your feet slightly apart, so you've got that good base of support. Your shoulders need to be relaxed. If you look on that little diagram I've put, we don't want hunched shoulders, and that's tense. There's too much tension on that. You need relaxed maneuverability in your shoulders. Really, playing an instrument is a very, very physical thing. And if your posture isn't correct, you're going to end up with all sorts of aches and pains. Your back should be nice and straight. If you're hunched over the piano, you're going to have a bad back if you're doing any amount of practice, and you're not going to have the manoeuvrability to get through your keyboard or whatever instrument it is that you're playing. And so scales are a good opportunity to do a spot check and think, okay, how am I sitting here? You might think you started off okay, and then as you get kind of into the practice, your posture will change and slip, and so as you're playing your scales, just kind of get that back. The final thing about why it's a good idea to do your scales regularly, apart from all of those physical aspects, there's a good psychology to it as well. When you sit at the instrument, you're going to play, you need to decide what it is that you want to achieve before you even start. There's a very big difference between practice and performance. If you're just going to play, just play for pleasure, that's a valid option. You could just sit there and play chopsticks or whatever it is that's under your fingers and just have a bit of a bash on the piano and just enjoy playing. That's a valid thing, and that's what we should do. We should enjoy playing. However, if that's all you ever do, you're not really going to progress. And so you need to decide, am I going to sit down and just play and noodle and enjoy, or am I going to practice? If it's sort of game on, game face on, practice, if you begin your practice session with a few scales, wrote around the list of scales that you've got to practice, it's kind of a psychological clue. I'm going to sit at the instrument and today I'm going to do some work. So before you do the pieces that you're working on, rattle through a few scales, work on some scales, and that's the psychology of, okay, I'm going to get some work done. Sometimes it's good to just practice scales just because it's fun. I have to admit, I really do enjoy practicing scales. Now, I'll be helping you through lots of individual scales on the next videos that I've got. However, before we get stuck into these, here are some general tips just for when practicing scales generally. Make sure to stay on top of all the scales that you've got to practice because, as I said earlier, there are an awful lot. You need to keep blowing the dust off them. I suggest that you work through your scales in a rota. Take 1 or 2 each day. That way you're not going to get overfaced, you're not going to get a bit overwhelmed with, oh my goodness, I've got so many scales to do. And that way as well, if you keep rotating them around, they'll all get an airing. If you've only got a few, you can perhaps just take 1 or 2 out of the list. Usually it's the syllabus that we're working on. So if it's like your grade 1 scales, your grade 2 scales, just keep working around that list. In the later grades, when you've got to play absolutely every scale imaginable in some form or other, I would suggest that you work chromatically. You can work an order of key going from no sharps, 1 sharp, 2 sharps and building up that way. However, oftentimes that means we leave the sort of the trickier ones till last, whereas if you work chromatically, so all the C scales, all the D flat scales, D scales, E flat scales, that way you mix and match the easy ones and the trickier ones. And that way, if you keep rotating them around, they'll all get an airing. Now, more specifically, when you're practicing scales, I would suggest that you think in twos. For example, give an accent. So if you're counting in crotchet beats, think in twos. Regardless of how many octaves you're doing, if you think in twos, that hides the lumps and bumps of where the fingering tucks are going on, and also it eliminates the fact that the thumb is bound to be the strongest finger in the scale. If you didn't think in twos, you'd end up with a lump or an accent every time you play with your thumb. What we don't want is it's just not musical. So if you think in twos, it takes a bit of thinking about and it takes a little bit of practice, but it's worth working on because it gives your scales a much more natural flow. I'll just show you again. Just flows so much better that way. Whatever scales you're doing, no matter whether you're advanced or at the beginning, start off with a hand separate scale. If you're on the later scales, then you'll need to play them together as well, but practice them separately as well as together. It seems a bit redundant, but it isn't, because in an exam situation, you could think, well, if I can play hands together, I'm bound to be able to play it separately, and then suddenly you'll get thrown, play me G major left hand on its own. It's like, oh, I haven't played G major left hand on its own. It just feels unfamiliar. You do get used to the patterns of playing things hands together. And so make sure that you give them an airing. And also, if you're practicing scales, it's always better to do more than less practice. So, you know, you can vamp up your practice time by, I'll do left hand, then I'll do right hand, then I'll do together. And that's so much more thorough then in your approach. But sometimes there is a tricky scale. If it's a really, really tricky scale and you just kind of keep getting it wrong and you keep falling over and you just can't get it right, my teacher years ago gave me this really, really clever tip. And if you practice it in a dotted rhythm and then go back to practice it in a straight rhythm, somehow that seems to just iron out the troubles. So let's say you're always struggling on this G major scale. And you can't find the flow, and you just need a little bit of help in nudging this on to the next stage of practice. Practice in a dotted rhythm like this. So it's long, short, long, short, long, short. It kind of takes you outside of what you've been working on. I think sometimes you just get too zoned in and you just practice the mistakes in. And so by practicing it in a different rhythm, it takes it away and gives it a fresh approach. And then when you go back after practicing it dotted, and going back to straight, thinking in twos, even rhythms, suddenly that seems dead easy in comparison. A final little tip that my teacher gave me is to create for yourself what we call a scale box. It's like a brand tub of scales. Oftentimes, it's a natural thing to practice in a certain progression. So you'll either be working through your syllabus list in a particular order, or you'll be working chromatically just to make sure that you get through each of the scales that you need to. If you create for yourself a scale box, what you do, you just write down literally every permutation of the scale that you're working on, or the scale list that you're working on, I should say. So let's say you'd have C major right hand, C major left hand, C major together, G major right hand, G major left hand, G major together, so on and so forth until you've got the list, and literally write out a list of every permutation, cut them up, fold them up and pop them into a pot, and then rummage round, take out a scale and think, right, I'll do this one. And it really just makes it unpredictable. You've no idea what's coming next. You probably have a mixture of scales and arpeggios and all sorts in that little scale box, and it makes it totally unpredictable, and it really tests if you just think, yeah, I know that scale. You think you know them, and then you take them out of your usual order and it throws you. It's like, oh, I don't know this scale now. If you want, just to save yourself a little bit of trouble, I have written out the ABRSM scales ready to cut up and put in your scale box on my PDF on my website. If you look up sharonbill.com and go and find the PDFs there, you'll find all of the work done for you for grades 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 of the ABRSM syllabus. And all you've got to do is just chop them up. I suggest that what you do is kind of take them out of the hat as you go along, and so if you've only got 10 minutes, you'll just take a couple out. If you've got a bit of a time to have a bash, then get through the whole scale box in one go if you're feeling in the mood. The ones that you can do no problem at all, pop to one side. The ones that you're struggling with, you can either pop to another side or pop back into the box, and you'll know that these are the ones that you need to keep working with, and you'll end up with a group of scales that are easy peasy on one side. I think I know those, and you'll end up with a group of scales you think perhaps you knew them, and then you find out, oh, I stumbled. If you make one mistake, you can't put it in the list of I know how to play this scale. You need to put it back until it's absolutely foolproof. And then when you've kind of learned it enough and you think, yeah, I can do that now, no problem at all, then you can put it on the list, and it gives you a good visual encouragement of what you do know, what you don't know. Hopefully that set you up ready to get going on the scales practice. Coming in the later videos, you'll see all of the different scales that there are to work through. I'll start with just the basic ones, and then hopefully that'll encourage you to really factor in scales into your practice regime. It's a really, really important part of your routine. Don't just think of them as a bolt-on burden that you have to kind of just do a bit. It's so much more important than you perhaps give it credit for. And actually, once you've got them under your fingers, it's really enjoyable. Hopefully that's encouraged you. Thanks for watching. If you could hit the like button to show that you like my video, and if you subscribe to my channel, then you will be sure not to miss out on what's coming next. And there's lots to get going, so let's get cracking. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.